In a small, quiet town on the edge of a vast forest, the winter had come early. The trees stood bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Snowflakes drifted down from the gray sky, covering the world in a soft, silent blanket. The streets were nearly deserted, except for one lonely figure, the little stray dog. He had been wandering the streets for weeks now. His fur was matted, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat, and his eyes had lost their sparkle of hope. People would walk by, barely noticing him, their faces turned away in the biting cold. He had no name, no place to call home, only the endless streets and alleys that never gave him shelter. His only companions were the sounds of the wind howling through the town, and sometimes the distant rumble of a car. One frigid evening, as he trotted through the snow-covered streets, a strange sound caught his attention, a faint, desperate cry. His ears perked up, and instinctively, he followed the sound. It led him to a small, modest house at the end of a narrow street. There, in the front yard, something unusual caught his eye. A baby, barely a year old, was lying in a blanket, forgotten and abandoned on the cold ground. The child's tiny hands were stretched out, as if reaching for something, anything, but there was no one to answer. The baby's face was flushed from the cold, its body trembling with each gust of wind. Without thinking, the stray dog rushed over, his paws leaving prints in the snow. He nudged the baby gently with his nose, trying to get some reaction. But the baby, too weak to cry out, merely whimpered softly. His heart raced. He couldn't leave the child like this. The dog's instincts kicked in. He curled his body around the baby, forming a warm, protective barrier against the biting cold. He licked the child's face, trying to rouse it, but the baby remained still. It was clear that the baby needed warmth, desperately. The dog lay still, pressing his body against the child, hoping that the warmth of his own body might provide some relief. Minutes passed, and the dog's body was beginning to feel the chill too. His own teeth began to chatter, but he didn't move. He remained vigilant, keeping his watch over the baby, determined not to abandon it. At that moment, the door of the house creaked open. A woman in her 30s stepped outside, her face pale with worry. She had heard the faint cries of her child and rushed out, but what she saw shocked her. There, in front of her house, the stray dog was lying next to her baby, his body pressed against the infant's small frame, offering his warmth and protection. The woman gasped, rushing forward and scooping her baby into her arms. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at the dog, still shivering on the ground, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet, almost pleading gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. She stroked the baby's face and noticed that, while the child was still cold, it seemed to be breathing more steadily. The dog had saved the baby, no doubt about it. Without hesitation, the woman stepped toward the dog. "You poor thing," she murmured as she reached down to touch his fur. He winced at her touch, flinching slightly, but did not pull away. She was kind, and her warmth was enough to reassure him that she was not a threat. The woman crouched down, her hand gently resting on his head. "Come inside," she said softly. "You need warmth too." It wasn't just kindness in her voice, but something deeper, a recognition of the bond that had already formed between the dog and her child. The dog, after a moment's hesitation, stood up and followed her inside. Once inside, the woman made sure the baby was safely wrapped in a warm blanket, then turned her attention to the dog. She dried him off with a towel, noticing how thin and dirty he was. She fed him the scraps she could find in the kitchen, her heart swelling with a love for this little creature who had saved her child's life. As the days passed, the dog, now named Shadow for his quiet, watchful presence, became an inseparable part of their lives. The woman, who was a single mother named Claire, grew closer to Shadow with each passing day. She saw the way he watched over her child, always keeping a gentle but protective eye on the baby as it grew. He would lie beside the crib at night, never once leaving the side of the child he had saved. Claire often found herself talking to him, telling him how grateful she was. "You're family now, Shadow. You saved my baby. You're the best protector," she would say, scratching behind his ears. The dog, in his silent way, seemed to understand. His tail would wag softly in response, and he would nuzzle her hand, showing the affection that had bloomed between them. In time, Shadow began to trust Claire more and more. He would follow her around the house, always close but never demanding. His eyes, once full of wariness and fear, now held a deep sense of contentment and peace. He had found his place, his home. No longer was he the lonely stray, wandering in the cold. He was family, and the love between them was undeniable. But perhaps the most profound moment came one winter evening, a year after Shadow had first appeared at Claire's doorstep. The snow fell heavily outside, blanketing the town in a soft hush. Claire and her baby, now a toddler, sat by the fireplace, the crackling warmth filling the room. Shadow lay by their feet, his body curled comfortably into the soft carpet. Claire looked down at him, her eyes full of gratitude. She had once feared she might lose her child to the cold, but Shadow had come to her rescue, not just saving the baby's life, but changing hers forever. "You've given us both so much," she whispered. "Thank you, Shadow." The dog raised his head, his eyes locking with hers. In that gaze, there was no need for words. The bond they shared was beyond that. It was pure, simple, and unbreakable. And as the snow continued to fall, Claire knew that they would always have each other. The incredible bond between humans and their furry companions.